Today is the 5th day of the October-November 85 retreat. At first, a request that people who stay in the dorm areas or the basement bedrooms use some extra care to be quiet in opening and closing room doors or bathroom doors. One person said to me, a request was just mentioned that people who stay in the basement, bedrooms or in the dormitory use extra care when they open and close doors. Someone said, if you try to be extra quiet, turns out you're extra noisy. That's really something interesting to look into if one is interested. If the care in opening the door and closing the door comes out of the realization that there are people who are resting or sleeping, and one has no opinion about people resting or sleeping during the daytime or at whatever time. It's just what is. And the mind is really on being quiet, actually being that person too who is resting. One has a feeling for that. Then it's possible to open and close a door relatively quietly. But if one starts out with that and then some other idea takes over the mind, for instance, that one is much more quiet in closing this door than the person who's sleeping in there, then the last half inch may slam. Not intentionally, but because it takes attention to close the door quietly down to the last contact. And it is a real indication to oneself that the mind was someplace else when this process of doing this is interrupted through some image coming up about oneself being so quiet, and one has already slammed one's foot against something. Someone asked, is there really any real joy in life? Whom is one asking, and from whom does one want the answer? Does it help if someone describes joy as best as that is possible? Does this help one to feel it oneself? Or does it set up another thing that one wants and feels dejected in not having, that one pursues? That's the strange thing about joy, that it is unpursuable. One may try, but one can't get it. Remember, for many, many years in my life, dating back to my childhood, wanting to find a happiness that lasted. And the only time that it seemed to be attainable was in looking forward to something. So I always would think of something that I could look forward to. My birthday or Christmas or a vacation. Always be sure to have something to look forward to. And this anticipatory, I don't know what to call it, feeling of maybe it'll be there. It wasn't verbalized. It was just looking forward to something, which when it came was never the same feeling as looking forward to it. Not that there weren't happy days. But then there was also this tendency, a real strong tendency to ask myself at a moment that there was something going on that felt good, am I happy now? And immediately something fractured. That was so noticeable, because with this fracture there was a real sadness that was incomprehensible. It's the sadness of this separation of the seeker from what she's seeking, or the enjoyer of what one wants to enjoy, this duality. Am I happy now? And it's broken. Because there is no joy when there is fracture, division. With that comes sadness and the pursuit of something to get rid of the sadness. There's a real impressive show I once saw on television many years ago. It was a play made for television. The main characters were two clowns. They weren't these exaggerated clowns, just guys in dilapidated, two guys in very dilapidated black clothes and black top hat, not all this clown makeup on, who were conversing with each other off and on with large intervals of not saying anything, if I remember this whole thing right. But that doesn't matter, whether it's really how it was. In a desolate landscape, which was sort of desert-like, but not the beauty of a desert. It was desolate. And it stretched for miles. One didn't see the end of it. And these two clowns kept reminding each other that they were waiting for Godot. Whoever that was, they didn't know who it was. But this is how they spent the time in this desert. If there's ever been a depiction of boredom, this was it. Not knowing what to do with themselves and looking for something to do. One of them, I think, noticed that his shoes were much too small. They were pinching and hurting terribly. So they set about to pull that shoe off. One helping the other. Took a lot of time, a lot of occupation. And then finally the shoe came off, of course. The guy tumbled over and they laughed. It was very funny. And then one of them said, "We laughed." And the other one said, "Yes, we laughed." The first one said, "We were happy." The other one said, "Yes, we were happy." And then they said, "What are we going to do now?" Another story comes to mind about a visit. Maybe I've told it once, but I'll tell it again. There are people who may not have heard it. We were visiting my husband's parents in Denver. It was a small house. It used to get very hot during the day, and all the windows and all the doors were opened at night so that the cool breeze would come through, cool down the house. My father-in-law was sort of an irascible character. He was almost constantly, talking about how the banks were robbing people of money. And so did FDR, of whom he had nothing good to say. It was a pleasure for him to get to talk about FDR and lure us into this conversation. Because to us, FDR was somebody to admire, and this was just what he needed to get into a real juicy argument about taking money out of his pocket to give to these good-for-nothing bums to make them just lazier than they were, meaning social programs. That's what he was talking about. He was very ingenious in his expression. If at the time we hadn't gotten so involved in the argument, it would have really been quite funny how he expressed himself and the whole process. So we were leaving the next morning, and early in the morning, I woke up from an incredible laughter coming out of their bedroom. He's just really laughing from the bottom of his soul. I'd never heard him laugh like that. Maybe I should say what had happened the day or the evening before. We had gone to a place where a new highway had been built, broken through some mountain ridges, and since the strata were so beautifully exposed at that point where the highway was blasted through the mountain ridge, they had made a little geological exhibit out of this exposure of strata, labeling each and the time of each strata all the way down to the bottom. And at one point there was a big, beautifully colored and very simply and easily to read diagram of the whole thing. And since my parents-in-law couldn't walk very much anymore, we had taken chairs along, and they were sitting there while we were walking up and down the rest of this exhibit. And my father-in-law had always believed, and There was no doubt in his mind that the earth had been created something like 5000 BC, because he was a strong believer in the Bible. And I guess somehow or other this is what the Bible says. And on the way back, after folding the chairs up, putting them in the trunk, sitting back down, he said hardly anything. Except every once in a while he would express amazement that this dated back millions and millions of years. And in the morning when he woke up, he laughed. And then he said, "Dear, dear." He meant his wife. They always called each other dear. They argued almost all of the time, but they always called each other dear. Never any bad name. "Dear, dear," he said, "there is no time. What are we running hither and thither for? There just is no time." Something like that, he said. "What are we scrambling all over the place for?" And she wasn't too humored. It was 5 o'clock in the morning, or something like that. And later when we came to breakfast, he was still glowing with this discovery, which it was so clear to him, he didn't have to explain it. He didn't have to argue about it. There was nothing to be argued. Later on this paled and went away. I think he remembered that later on. So is there any real joy in life? One pursues it, which we've done for thousands of years. What do we have in our hands? But if, for whatever strange reason, the mind is empty of pursuit, empty of this constant need to fill the emptiness, no reflection, am I happy or not? No me, no sense of self, then maybe shuffling through the leaves, these piles of leaves there in the woods, the sound of it, the colors of it, and the different combinations of color depending on what tree one is shuffling under. All of a sudden there is a pink or a purple together with a yellow and brown, and in between these indescribable white pine with long fine needles catching the sunlight and just bursting with the joy of the day, maybe meeting someone on the way, even a hunter, and just this lovingness comes from nowhere, comes out of no idea, out of no intention or pursuit. And not to hang on to it or to want it again. Retrace one's steps to look for it. That's the fracture. And with that comes the sadness. And the fear of maybe never having it again. actually what we're going to talk about this morning is fear. Because it does come up in sitting, not just in sitting, but here one is confronted with it much more starkly or concretely than during the daytime, where one has found 1,001 way of escaping from it. Not taking the time or care to look at those escapes, one just walks them or runs them. But here there's an opportunity to meet fear. The 1,000 fears that we have. And to wonder what fear is, whether it has a root bottom cause, what it is connected with, at what instances it arises, what its very nature is. Here, it's possible to look into that. And not just habitually repress it or escape into fantasy or whatever one may have learned to do. One person came in once and said, had this tremendous ache in the lower abdomen. And on questioning it, whether it was maybe sort of a pushing into the hara. I haven't mentioned this word in a long time. It's a Japanese word for this lower region. He said, yeah, that's what I've been doing. There's been some fear. And the immediate response to pump into the hara in order to get energy, to fight that fear. It wasn't all this clearly conceptualized, but this is in fact what happened. And he said, I created a monster down here. That's how it felt. An enormous knot. So to observe carefully what instant measures one takes the moment fear is felt. Maybe before it even comes into full consciousness, the measure has already been taken, the habitual measure. So the attention has to be right there to discern that, to see it, detect it. Not to take countermeasures, but just to see it. Because if one sees some, if an unconscious mechanism becomes conscious, it changes. Most of the time. So what are all these fears that beset the mind, that come to surface when the surface is not quite as occupied as it is during our daily life? Not, I say again, not that the fears aren't there, but then we manage to drown them out, or the daily life, the hecticness, all the activities drown being in touch with fear. In direct touch. If it's fear of not being liked, fear of loneliness, fear of insecurity in the future, what will one live on if one doesn't have a job or loses one's job? Fear of sickness one has had, all kinds of sicknesses and the fear of these sicknesses coming back or getting worse. Fear of war or fear of the bomb. Fear of having done something wrong. Either something one remembers having done wrong or one doesn't even know what, but fear of wrongdoing. In the past, in the present, and in the future. Fear of being found out for something one has done. Fear of punishment, disapproval, criticism. Fear of not finding what one is seeking. Fear of something happening to one, of not continuing the way one wants to continue, of not making the grade, of failing, of not being as good as others. Fear of losing friends, losing what one is most attached to, or whom one is most attached to. And always there, lodged in the mind somewhere or other, this fear of death, which means fear of not continuing as one knows oneself, fear of ending. Many more fears. Fear of being ridiculed, laughed at, not taken seriously, not comparing well with others. But all of these fears, what do they have in common? If one looks at it. In common with all of these fears that have been mentioned, isn't there, that there is thinking involved? Thinking, which comes out of memories, which were laid down long ago or recently by experiences that one had, and now they're in the memory bank of the brain, and from there thoughts issue about how it was and how it may be. Not that these thoughts aren't connected with emotions, sensations, and feelings of all kinds. And some frightful memories may indeed be not verbal thought or idea, may have happened to a child before the child had language, and yet a memory of a frightening incident is recorded, is there in the memory. And if anything reminds of that, the fear response of the whole body is triggered. So thought is connected with all fears. Look at it. When there's fear, what is the whole process, so that the mind isn't just caught in the fear, but tries to examine what is happening to it. Which takes energy. It is the energy of attention, awareness. There's thought connected with it, and inevitably, time. The memories that were laid down in the past, and the thoughts projected from those memories into what we call the future, the time that hasn't come yet, but thought creates that time that will come. It can do that vividly, even though in reality there is no future, there's only this moment. The future is the creation of thought out of what has happened before, a recombination or exact reproduction of what happened, visualized or imagined or thought about to happen in the future. And the same fear responses that were triggered in the past and are now associated with this event, with this memory, can also be elicited just by thinking it may happen in the future. Because the whole body-mind system is a network of associations, thoughts with sensations, feelings, emotions, muscles, glands. It's all interconnected. Why is it all interconnected? Is there a reason for that? For human beings who appeared on this earth quite poorly equipped in comparison to animals, not as strong muscles, not as good eyes, not as sharp teeth, not as good ears as many of the animals, no wings to fly off. Develop this brain which can register what happened and learn from it, make provisions for the future, anticipate an event, and this way create protection. Not that the animals don't have the beginnings of all of that, but not to this refined degree. Of learning from experience, anticipating in the future, and making provisions that this will not happen again. What the brain also creates through memory, and this is to be tested by each one of us, not to be believed in or taken over, but to be discovered for oneself. What the brain also creates is the image of, or the thought and idea of me existing through time. Like all the photographs that were taken of one's life. That's me. Now I'm here, now I'm there, now I'm this. Thoughts stringing it all together, and the constant in that being the me, I, ego, whatever you want to call it. Actually, as far as this organism right now is concerned, I don't know whether I'm physiologically correct, but is totally different from the organism. Even 7 years ago, there's supposed to be quite a turnover. Somebody told me some cells don't change, but most of them do regenerate themselves, renew themselves. So, most of what sits here now is not what if it sat here 7 years ago would have sat there. It's different. What is still the same is the memories, if they are indeed nourished and cherished and re-invoked and not allowed to fade away. Then the memories are what persists, what is the same. And the same work that the brain does to provide protection or to ensure survival of this organism, because this is what the brain developed for, to ensure the survival of this organism. The brain also does the same thing to ensure the survival of this thought of me. Somehow or other, this connection has been made that this is important to survive. The thought of me, the idea of myself. Else we wouldn't be so incredibly frightened and take actions either to escape or to fight when this me feels threatened. When the organism is actually threatened, then to run away, escape, or to attack is the natural thing to do. That's what the program is. It's how we have developed from the animals. And associated with this readiness to either escape or fight are tremendous responses, glandular, organismic, muscular responses set into motion, which are then used to get away or to defend oneself. But if what is threatened is the image of me, while I'm sitting at a desk, somebody comes in and rakes me over the coals for something I did, and either fear or anger, fear to get away from this threatening situation, or anger to lash out. If that doesn't happen, then one is stuck with all that the organism is now churning with. The tension, the functioning, the over-functioning of heart, liver, gallbladder, you name it. That's why human beings are probably so ill so often, because all these organs that serve a certain function in natural life are still asked to perform their function, but they can't really do it. The juices that are poured out aren't being absorbed, or the tension isn't being used to run. So then a new fear comes up, the fear of not well-being, of pain, ache, tension, misfunction of the organs. And that fear generates new physical responses. Because you can observe that so carefully and correctly, accurately, that one thought can set the whole organism afire with some emotion. Anger or fear, jealousy, rage. It needs but one thought, which isn't really one thought. It is connected with all the past experiences of anger or fear, rage or jealousy. There's an interconnection of our memory system. Can one begin to observe this with an observation or a listening which is quiet, non-judgmental, and utterly impersonal? Because what is observed is not my mind or your mind or his mind or hers, but the human mind in action, in the process of creating its own traps and escapes which are no escapes. Can one really see that fears are triggered by thought, by memory, and that they always involve time in one way or another? Time being created by thought. Not to remember a theory about this and then believe in the theory, but to observe as it happens, with a seeing or an insight that is open, free, has no vested interest to find something to confirm an opinion, or it's totally open. Uninvested. Not tied to any traditional view. Because the moment one has already a theory about it, one cannot see clearly. Once all the physical symptoms appear of a fearful thought, can one abstain from fear of those symptoms or annoyance with them, because these only create further symptoms, but just listen quietly to what is in motion, to what is going on, without interfering? Sounds so simple, and it is simple, but it's not easy. Because the habitual escapes are so automatic, they are also associated with this whole complex. But it is not impossible to spot an escape as it arises and not go that way, just to stay with the misery, the fear, which one will not label in old-fangled terms, because that associates it with the past. Not knowing it doesn't associate anything with the past. Not knowing is being disconnected from what one knows about this feeling right now. And therefore, if there's an interest to find out what it is, one has to be that. Not know it as an outside knower, but just really be that. With no fracture. If there's hope that it'll go away if I do that, that's a fracture. Then there's me and my hopes, and it's all divided up again. The whole mass is cut up. This fear of dying, can one look at that? What it means to be afraid of dying? Not just so habitually brush it away. If it comes up, if one comes upon it. Because it is there, the concept of death is lodged in the brain, the idea of death. It can only be the idea of death because what dying actually is unknowable. Dying means not knowing. The end of knowing. the end of all ideas about this thing. That's what death is. But the concept of death sits there in the computer. And not just the concept of death, but all the ideas we have about it. The horror of it, or the sadness of it. The inevitability of it. And whatever tradition we have grown up in or adopted, what will happen to us after death, which is most of the time a comforting idea, that there won't be an ending. Somehow or other I will continue if I manage to believe the right thing. What is this attachment to this idea of me and the tremendous desire to have that idea continue? Because that this organism will not continue forever, I think is quite clear. Nothing continues forever. It strolls through the woods. That's so clear as the daylight or the moonlight. These beautiful logs covered with a shimmering green and fungus, these scalloped fungus. When they break up, there's this fine, crumbly, fragrant mass of something or other. So that the organism, as anything else, dies is a fact. But I think our fear is much more the fear of this image of me not going on, and there's a tremendous attachment to the image of me, which is the same thing that causes hurt when somebody offends me, criticizes me. And yet if one watches, one sees that the source of our fears and sorrows is always this me in collision with itself, with its conflicting, fractured desires, and with other me's. Is it worth continuing? It's not asked so that one make a choice and then decide, no, it's not worth continuing, I'll get rid of it. Well, that's a thought. And if one looks at it carefully, it's in order to get to a better state for me. So I am rid of this fear of not continuing. If I could get rid of me, then I would be without fear. It's still the same kind of a process of wanting everlasting security and existence as an idea. Do you see that? Somebody told me once, if I could really know what death is, then maybe I wouldn't be afraid of it. Anybody could tell me what death is. Of course, there are people, whenever there's a demand, there is a supply. And people will tell one what death is in all kind of versions. But I don't think it has eliminated the fear of death. Maybe it has for some, or to believe in reincarnation. continuing as what? As the same frightened me that one is now? With all its conflicts and sorrows and escapes? Does one want that to continue? That's what is continuing and has continued over thousands of years. What seems to be reborn all the time is the same fears, the same desires, the same escapes, the same hopes and belief systems, over and over again. So, can one ask what it means to end? Not make an end to this life, committing suicide, but what it means to end as a concept, as an image. Living in time that has been produced by thought. I think it needs observing the image, the me, in action, and all its consequences so carefully that it becomes so clear how useless it is, how divisive, how pain-producing, how fear-producing, how pleasure-producing, and then holding on to this pleasure and wanting it back at all costs, rather than just being here, without any escape, and no image of what one will be tomorrow, what will happen to one the next moment. Can an image end the instant it is detected to take over the mind? And then be with fear if fear comes up? Because a thought has already uttered, well, what if you're nothing? I don't want to be nothing. That's a thought. What is the actuality of it? Of being nothing? Not the idea, the concept of it. That's usually horrifying to human beings, even though that's what we all are. Nothing. Nothing in terms of what we think we are. Somebody said to me, remembering that it was mentioned before that we're nothing, this person said, if I start with that and tell myself I'm nothing, I don't know what to do with that. Obviously not, if it is a concept. To drop all these concepts and to start with what is there. The image, the idea, and the fear or anger. And can one be with that without a fracture? And in a space that's wide open, not so limited, I want to be with it in order that I get better or feel better. That's this tunnel of a space. With an awareness or a listening that is not hemmed in by anything, because it doesn't expect anything. Just listening. Whether there's something there or not. We will end here for today.